My mother-in-law handed me a dish towel the moment I walked through the door. Not a hello, not a hug, just a towel pressed into my palm like I was the caterer who'd shown up late. She had no idea she was handing it to the woman who owned the building her son's law firm operated out of. The eviction notice wasn't drafted yet, but it would be. My name is Reyna Caldwell. I'm 32 years old, and I was driving down I-95 toward Greenwich, Connecticut when my husband called to remind me about his sister's engagement party. Like I could forget. I'd been dreading it for 3 weeks. The October sky was doing that thing it does along the Connecticut coast. Bruised purple at the edges, gold where the sun hadn't given up yet. Beautiful, if you were in the mood to notice it. I wasn't. I'd been on back-to-back calls since 6 that morning. My coffee had gone cold somewhere in New Jersey. My blazer was hanging in the back seat because I refused to walk into that house looking like I'd been in a boardroom since dawn, even though I had been. My husband, Patrick, meant well. He always means well. That's the thing about him that I loved first, and that later became the most complicated part of everything. He'd grown up in a family where his mother's word was architecture. It held everything up, and you simply did not question the load-bearing walls. So when he said, "Just try, Reyna," for me, I heard it for what it was. A man asking his wife to walk into a room where she'd never once been made to feel welcome and smile. I tried. Patrick's family lived in a colonial off Round Hill Road that had been in the family for 2 generations. Stone fireplace, original hardwood, a kitchen that had been renovated twice to look like it hadn't been renovated at all. The kind of house that whispered old money so quietly you almost missed it. Almost. His mother, who I will simply call my mother-in-law because she never once asked me to call her anything warmer, opened the door before I'd reached the porch steps. She was already turned back toward the interior when she said it. The towel extended behind her like an afterthought, like passing a baton in a relay she'd been running without me. "The caterers set things up wrong in the kitchen. You don't mind helping sort it out, do you, Reyna? You're good at that sort of thing." I don't know what sort of thing she meant. I'd never catered anything in my life. But I took the towel because Patrick was right behind me and his eyes were doing that quiet pleading thing, and I'd been trying for 4 years to build something with this family that resembled peace. The party was for his younger sister, who I'll call my sister-in-law, because that's what she technically is, or was, depending on how you count the months that followed. She was engaged to a man named Garrett, who was pleasant enough in the forgettable way of men who've never had to work very hard for anything. Her ring was enormous. Her happiness seemed genuine. I was glad for her, or tried to be, while I reorganized trim cocktail trays in a kitchen that smelled like gardenias and passive aggression. Patrick's aunt found me in there. She was the kind of woman who has never said a cruel thing in her life, but has a gift for delivering them inside other sentences. She patted my hand and said, "Oh, you're so hopeful, Reyna. Patrick's lucky you're so practical." I set down the tongs. I looked at the ceiling for 1 second, then I picked them up again. The party moved into the formal sitting room. About 40 people, a mix of country club regulars and Patrick's father's law colleagues and neighbors who'd known the family since Patrick was in Little League. I circulated. I smiled. I answered politely when people asked what I did. "I work in real estate," I said, which is technically accurate the way saying Hemingway wrote some books is technically accurate. But I had learned over 4 years that saying more invited a particular kind of skepticism in this room. The kind where people nod slowly and ask if I work for an agency, and I say no, and they nod again, and something in their expression shifts, and I spend the next 20 minutes watching them decide whether to believe me. My mother-in-law heard me tell a woman named, I honestly don't remember, someone in pearls that I was in real estate. She appeared at my elbow the way she always did, silently, efficiently. "Reyna does property management," she said, with a brightness that could strip paint. "Very stable. Practical work." There was that word again. Not glamorous, but someone has to do it. The woman in pearls made a sympathetic sound. I excused myself to get more wine. Standing at the bar cart in the corner, I looked around the room. Patrick was laughing at something his father said. My sister-in-law was glowing the way people glow when they're getting exactly what they expected life to give them. My mother-in-law moved through the party like she owned it, which she did, in every way that mattered to her. She did not know, had never asked, had never been curious enough to wonder, that 18 months prior, I had quietly purchased 3 commercial properties in Stamford through a holding company registered in Delaware. One of them was the building at 44 Commerce Street, where Patrick's father's firm, Harlow and Associates, leased 2 floors. Had leased them for 11 years. Considered them, I imagined, quite permanent. I hadn't bought those properties to use as leverage. I want to be clear about that. I bought them because the numbers made sense, and because I'd spent 7 years learning to read a market the way other people read weather patterns. I bought them because I was good at it, quietly and without applause, the way my grandmother had taught me to do anything worth doing. My grandmother had raised me after my mother passed when I was 9. She was a woman who had worked the front desk of a hotel in Atlanta for 31 years, who had put 3 kids through college on tips and discipline and a refusal to be made small. She used to tell me, "Don't announce yourself. Just show up prepared." She had a framed print in her kitchen, faded, slightly crooked, that read, "The tree that bears the most fruit bends the lowest." I never fully understood it until I was about 27, standing in my first closing, handing over a check that would have made her cry. She passed before she got to see where it went. That's the part I carry. By the time the engagement party ended, I'd helped rearrange one kitchen, been called practical 3 times, and watched my mother-in-law tell 2 different people that her son had married a girl who was sweet but very quiet. Quiet? As if silence were the only gear I had. In the car on the way home, Patrick said I'd done great. I looked out the window and watched Greenwich disappear behind us. I said, "I know." What happened next came in pieces, the way bad things usually do. The first piece, 2 months later, Patrick's firm, not his father's, his own, the one he'd built from a 2-person operation in Midtown, started having trouble with a major client. A client that represented about 1/3 of their billings. I won't go into the details because they belong to him and not to this story, but the pressure was real, and it came home with him, and our apartment in the city felt smaller for a while. The second piece, my mother-in-law started calling more often, not to ask how I was, to give advice. "Patrick needs stability right now," she told me in one call with the careful emphasis of a woman who had a conclusion already drawn. "He needs to feel like things at home are settled." As if I were the unsettled variable. As if I hadn't been the one holding our finances together since before the client trouble started. The third piece, and the one that cracked everything open, Patrick's sister's engagement party, the formal one, the one with 120 guests at a venue in Westport, April, dogwood season. The kind of evening that looks pretty in photos regardless of what's happening inside them. I had driven up from the city alone. Patrick had a deposition that ran long and was meeting me there. I arrived first, which meant I walked in alone, which meant I was available when my mother-in-law needed something arranged and spotted me in the entryway with no one to buffer me. She did not hand me a towel this time. She handed me a clipboard. "The florist left the centerpiece manifest," she said. "Can you just check them against the tables? You're so detail-oriented." I looked at the clipboard. I looked at her. Something in my expression must have shifted, because she added, more slowly, "Unless you'd rather not. But you did such a lovely job at the house in October." I handed the clipboard back. "I'd rather not," I said. "I'm a guest." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. She smiled, a particular kind of smile that has no warmth anywhere in its architecture, and said, "Of course. My mistake." It wasn't a mistake, but I walked away from it because I had somewhere to be and something to wait for, and I had learned that patience is not the same as surrender. Dinner was a long table situation, assigned seating. I was placed at the far end between 2 of my father-in-law's law partners. They talked to each other across me for most of the first course. Patrick arrived during the salad, kissed my cheek, mouthed that sorry, and sat down 6 seats away at the only open chair left. The speeches started after the entree. My father-in-law went first. Warm, practiced, the speech of a man who gives a lot of speeches, then an old family friend. Then my mother-in-law stood up, and the room quieted the way rooms do when a woman of a certain authority takes the floor. She spoke beautifully about her daughter. She spoke about the family Garrett was joining. She spoke about the values they held, legacy, service, reputation, the long work of building something that lasts. It was genuinely moving. She was talented at this. Then she said something that I replayed in my head for weeks afterward. "We are so proud," she said, "of the life our children are building. Patrick especially, he has worked so hard against real odds to become the man he is today." She looked down the table at Patrick. She did not look at me. "We are grateful," she continued, for the support of the people around him. Support. People, not wife, not not even his partner. The people around him. Like I was a structural element she'd chosen not to name. Like I was furniture that had been arranged correctly and could now be ignored. Patrick told me afterward that she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I believe he believed that. I went to the restroom after the speeches. I ran cold water over my wrists, which is something my grandmother taught me to do when you need to slow down and not make a decision while angry. I looked at my reflection. I thought about the tree that bends the lowest. I called my attorney from a stall in the Westport venue bathroom. She picked up on the second ring because she's Tara, and Tara picks up. How fast can we draft a letter to Harlow and Associates? I asked. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. She knew the property. She knew the lease. She said, define fast. Monday, I said. Monday's fine. What kind of letter? Rent adjustment, I said, and request for meeting. I went back to the party. I had the creme brulee. It was very good. What I sent on Monday was not an eviction notice. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters and because what I did was not about cruelty. The letter, sent on the formal letterhead of Caldwell Property Holdings LLC, informed Harlow and Associates that the current lease terms for 44 Commerce Street, Stamford, were under review as part of a routine portfolio assessment. It requested a meeting with the principal stakeholders to discuss lease renewal terms for the upcoming calendar year. It was signed by me, by my full name, by my title, managing partner. I'm told my father-in-law read it 3 times. The call came that evening, not from him, from Patrick. He didn't yell. Patrick doesn't yell. He went very quiet, which is worse, and he said, Reyna, did you send this? Yes, I said. A long pause. The building is yours? The building is mine, I said. Has been for 1.5 years. Another pause, longer. Why didn't you tell me? And that's the question, isn't it? Why didn't I tell him? The honest answer is complicated and doesn't make me entirely sympathetic, and I've sat with it long enough to say it plainly. I didn't tell him because I had been trained, slowly and without any single dramatic moment, to make myself smaller in that family, to be practical and helpful and not take up too much space. And somewhere along the way, I had compartmentalized the parts of my life that were large and capable and mine, and kept them separate from the marriage where I was expected to be the support structure that didn't need a name. That's not Patrick's fault. Not entirely. It's the accumulated weight of 4 years of towels and clipboards and the people around him. We talked for 3 hours that night. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in probably 2 years. I won't recount all of it because some of it belongs only to us. But by the end, he understood things he hadn't understood before. And I understood that I had been disappearing in increments and calling it compromise. The meeting with my father-in-law happened the following Thursday. His office in Stamford. 31st floor, corner view, the kind of office designed to make the person across the desk feel small. I sat across the desk and did not feel small. He's a composed man. I'll give him that. He'd clearly had several days to process, and he came in prepared. He had questions about the holding company, the acquisition timeline, our respective obligations under the existing lease. Competent questions. The kind a good attorney would ask. I answered them all. Halfway through, he put down his pen. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not the polite tolerance of family dinners, something closer to actual attention. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. 7 years, I said. Seriously. Longer if you count the learning. He nodded slowly. And the other properties? I have 11, I said. Commercial and mixed use. Across 3 states. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. My wife doesn't know any of this. No, I said. She doesn't. He looked out the window, then back at me. What do you want, Reyna? I had thought about this carefully. I didn't want punishment. I didn't want to dismantle anything. I wanted something specific and fair and slightly uncomfortable for everyone involved. I want my name on the lease, I said. The renewal goes through me. Not a management company. Not an intermediary. Me, directly. And I want a conversation with your wife. He agreed to both. The conversation with my mother-in-law happened on a Saturday in the kitchen of the Round Hill Roadhouse, over coffee that nobody drank. Patrick was there, his father was there. His sister wasn't, which was probably for the best. My mother-in-law sat very straight. She's good at composure. I respect that, even now. I didn't arrive with prepared remarks. I just told her the truth. Not the financial truth, though that was part of it. The other truth. That I had spent 4 years trying to earn a place in her family's estimation and had been met every time with a diminishment so practiced it had started to feel like weather, something I just endured because it was always there. I told her about the towel, about the clipboard, about the people around him. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some version of the practiced smile. But she just listened, and her expression did something complicated and human that I hadn't seen on her face before. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I didn't think of you as capable," she finally said. It wasn't an apology. It was an admission, and in some ways that was harder to receive. "I think I decided early on what you were, and I never looked again. It's not the redemption arc you might want." She didn't cry. She didn't throw her arms around me. We are not, and will likely never be, close. But she looked at me, actually looked, and said, "I'd like to start over. If you're willing." I thought about my grandmother, about the tree. "I'm willing," I said, "but I'm not going to be small about it this time." She nodded once. "I wouldn't expect you to be." Patrick reached over and took my hand under the table, and I let him. What people outside the family eventually found out came in stages. The way these things do when they're not engineered for effect. One of my father-in-law's partners mentioned it at a firm dinner. Someone connected the dots on the Delaware holding company. A woman who ran in the same Greenwich circles as my mother-in-law apparently Googled me at some point and discovered the portfolio and the coverage I'd gotten in a commercial real estate trade publication the previous year. By summer, the conversation in those rooms had shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. My mother-in-law started introducing me differently, not as Patrick's wife or as someone in property management. She used my name. She said what I did. The first time I heard her say it, clearly without qualification, at a dinner at their club, to a woman who had previously asked if I was the one who helped with the kitchen, I had to look down at my water glass for a moment, not because it moved me to tears, more because I wanted to hold it quietly for a second before it became part of the air. The lease renewed. Harlow and Associates stayed in the building. The terms were fair. Everything was done in writing, correctly, with my name on every page. Months later, I was driving through Buckhead in Atlanta, checking on a small mixed-use property I'd acquired there, and I found myself in the neighborhood where my grandmother's house used to be. The block is different now. The corner store is a smoothie place, but her street is still her street. And I sat in the car in front of where the house was and thought about the framed print that's now sitting in my home office in the city. The tree that bears the most fruit bends the lowest. She didn't mean it as a warning about being overlooked. She meant it as a description of strength, that the ones who carry the most don't need to announce it. They just hold. I understand it differently now, though. I think the tree also gets to decide, eventually, when to stop bending, not out of bitterness, not to prove something, just because growth requires it. I've been talking to a small mentorship organization in Atlanta that supports first-generation real estate investors, women, mostly, who grew up the way I grew up and who don't have the networks or the access that smooth the way for other people. I've been quietly funding 2 participants a year for the past 3 years. Nobody in Greenwich knows about it. Patrick knows. That's enough. The morning I closed on my 12th property, a mixed-use building in Philadelphia, a former textile space with good bones and beautiful light, I sat in the settlement conference room while the attorneys did their back and forth, and I thought about the dish towel, about how I took it without thinking, about how long I had been taking things without thinking. I don't take things anymore without thinking. That's not a manifesto. It's not a victory lap. It's just the truth of what 4 years of learning to be seen, first by myself, then by others, actually looks like from the inside. It looks like a woman in a conference room, watching her name get signed on to something that matters, holding very still and knowing exactly what she's worth. I've thought a lot about the dish towel, not in a bitter way, more the way you think about a small object that turned out to be a hinge point, one of those moments that only looks significant in retrospect. When my mother-in-law handed it to me that first evening, she wasn't being deliberately cruel. That's what I've come to understand. She was doing something more automatic than cruelty. She was slotting me into a category she'd already decided on and never revisited. That's how most of the damage in our lives gets done, isn't it? Not through malice, but through incuriosity. Someone decides what you are before you've had a chance to show them, and then they stop looking. What I'd learned, what Reyna learned, slowly, over 4 years of towels and clipboards and being called practical like it was an apology, is that there are 2 ways to respond to that kind of erasure. You can fight it loudly, which usually just confirms whatever small narrative they've already written about you, or you can do something harder. You can keep building, quietly, without their approval as the fuel. My grandmother used to say that the most dangerous thing you can do is need something from someone who doesn't yet know your worth, because that need makes you wait. It makes you arrange yourself around their expectations, and while you're doing that, the work isn't getting done. Reyna didn't set out to hold leverage over her mother-in-law. That's the part people might misread. She bought those properties because the numbers made sense and because she was good at reading what others overlooked. The leverage was just a byproduct of doing her work well in private without asking anyone's permission to take up space. That's the thing about building something real. It doesn't need an audience to become real. But here's the part that actually matters. The part that isn't about property or lease agreements or a father-in-law reading a letter 3 times. When she finally sat down at that kitchen table and told the truth, she didn't do it to win. She did it because she'd finally decided that being unseen was costing her more than the discomfort of being seen would. That decision, to stop making yourself convenient for people who haven't earned your smallness, that's the actual turning point, not the contract, not the meeting. That quiet moment in a venue bathroom with cold water on her wrists and her grandmother's voice in her head. Intelligence built the portfolio. Discipline kept it growing through years when nobody in that family knew to ask. But it was something closer to moral courage, the willingness to say I am not going to be the help at my own story. That changed things. Those 3 things working together is the only combination that actually holds. The mentorship work she does now, the women she funds, the ones who grew up without the networks that smoothed the way for others, that's not charity. That's someone paying forward a lesson she learned the hard way, that the world has a habit of undercounting quiet people, and quiet people have an obligation to each other to refuse it. She's still in the family. Things are still imperfect, but her name is on the lease. And she's not small about it, neither should you be.